Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Simon. Yes, tonight's talk, it's about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and those of you who have maybe been to Mons might recognise the first picture, because if you like, this is the cemetery where it all started. This is St Symphorien on the outskirts of Mons, and of course it started by the Germans. It contains the first British soldier to have died in action during the First World War, and arguably the last soldier. So it's an extraordinary cemetery. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is talking to you about the experiences I had, because I was very fortunate that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission asked me to create their centenary book for the First World War, for the fallen. And in the course of that, I actually visited over 400 cemeteries. So it was looking at the history of those First World War cemeteries and some of the stories there. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they bury the dead from the two world wars. So that's from the 4th of August 1914 to the 31st of August 1921, and the 3rd of September 1939 to the 31st of December 1947. The work you're going to see tonight is all the First World War. I covered nothing from the Second World War. So it's looking at the cemeteries. Now, today, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, yes, it commemorates 1.7 million servicemen. You can see 1.1 million headstones, 23,000 locations around the world. An extraordinary number. It is probably the largest horticultural organization in the world. And it is indeed an organization, if you like, founded in traditions of honor and service of the First World War. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, there's 500 employees who've worked with them for over 20 years. I'll be touching on this later, but they do have a tradition of very long-serving staff. So it is this extraordinary big organization by its standards, and it's funded by the Ministry of Defence in perpetuity. So we'll look at that later on, because this obviously has implications. And it's present in, as you can see, a huge number of countries. When I had to do a map analysing how many countries were involved in the First World War, I came up with around 50, the figure was between 50 and 60. It's a debatable number, but the First World War really did touch the entire globe. Very, very few countries were uninvolved, one way or another, in the casualties of the First World War. And this gives you an idea of the sort of the weighting of where they are. Obviously 1.2 million in Europe, and then Asia in the Second World War. So these figures are for the overall combination of First and Second World Wars. Now, the problem that immediately occurred with the outbreak of the First World War was that this was a static war. So unlike previous battles, where generally speaking, the dead were the dead of just maybe 1 or 2 days, such as Waterloo, and you buried them in mass graves or whatever, the First World War was a static war where your numbers of dead piled up around men who were still fighting. This had happened in the American Civil War. And the American Civil War, we often forget, they suffered 600,000 dead in their Civil War. And you compare that with the fact that in our First World War, we lose around about 750 to 800,000 men. So the American Civil War, they realized, they discovered the need to organize national cemeteries. And this was done largely by a man called Edward Whitman, who traveled, he gathered together over 150,000 bodies into 20 national cemeteries. And he actually created the concept that it was a sign of democracy and civilization, that it's, as he said, a good sentiment for soldiers to fight and die by. Let the government show that it knows how to reciprocate that sentiment by tenderly collecting and nobly caring for the remains of those of us who in our greatest war have fought and died to rescue and perpetuate the liberties of us all. So there is this idea that created that in war, government had a duty, an obligation to those that had died to look after their lives honorably. Now, this picture represents the problem that was facing all the armies. That was literally when soldiers died on the battlefield, you shoved them in the nearest shell hole, you maybe shoved a rifle on top of the marker and you left them there because you couldn't bury them, and they began to smell, it was unhygienic, so something had to be done. And originally, the dead would have been just dumped there. And this, in fact, represents, for me anyway, those hundreds of thousands of soldiers who just were tipped into shell holes. This is a man called Edouard Vivaldi. He's a French soldier. He's killed in April 1917. This is the last battlefield grave on the Western Front. It's very closely guarded by the French army, but his equipment, his helmet are still there on his grave. His body has been exhumed, but this is his grave, and there's a little plaque there left by his father. So it's a very poignant place. And this would have been, you know, there would have been hundreds of thousands of these across the Western Front. These just simple battlefield. Now, today, it's all been tidied away, and every nation has its different way of burying its dead. People often say to me, oh, look at the French cemeteries. They're really, they don't care. They really don't care. They're just very sort of utilitarian places. Well, I think the thing is that for the French, the war had taken place on their soil and they wanted to get back to life. And they had a real problem in that they just had bodies everywhere. So they had to get rid of them. And we may not think their cemeteries are really particularly aesthetically pleasing, but they're a practical way of getting rid of the bodies. Either that, or yes, here you have an ossuary where you just have so many bodies. It was just impossible in 1919 to begin to. The German cemeteries, well, the Germans weren't especially popular, and of course, so they were made to consolidate their cemeteries. This is Langemark, the Ypres salient, many of you will know. And these are, if you like, places of real sorrow. The Germans' cemeteries are really quite downbeat. The trees are trees of mourning and sorrow. And of course, you have the beautiful sculptures of Kathy Kollwitz of the mourning parents. The Germans did this, it was about mourning for them. Whereas, of course, and for the Americans, well, the American cemeteries, they were based, if you like, around the state that people came from. If you look at every American grave, it actually states the state, because the American army in 1917-18 largely been formed or based on individual states' national guards. And that was how they were formed. So this becomes very, very important. And the American crosses are just very simple. It's the name of the person, their unit, and the state and date of death. Whereas the British cemeteries have a very different flavour. And the flavour comes from this man, Fabian Ware, who was actually, he had had a career out in South Africa, working for the British Empire. And he was on the Western Front working with the Red Cross, and he began to realise that by the end of 1914, that the dead bodies were mounting up and there was no real register being kept up. Till that time, it was the responsibility of each regiment to keep a tally of its dead and where they're buried. And so in March 1915, he came up with the idea of a grave registration service. And they negotiated an agreement for the French to be given the land. And in 1916, he introduced the system of dog tags to help identify the bodies when they were lying on the ground. And in May 1917, the Imperial War Graves Commission was formed. And it's very interesting because, as I said, he'd worked in South Africa and he had a very specific idea about what cemeteries were going to be and what they were going to commemorate. And they were going to be to keep alive the ideals for the maintenance and defense of which they've laid down their lives, to strengthen the bonds of union between all classes and races, and to promote a feeling of common citizenship and loyalty and devotion to us and to the empire of which they are subjects. Let us remember the imperishable glory and unsurpassed heroism of the greater multitude of dead nurtured in these islands, the home and focus of freedom, which gains an added brilliance from the devotion and sacrifice of their fellow subjects from overseas. Thousands of years hence, some of them will still be there to remind the world of a British Empire that was one and indivisible when assailed. So we have this very specific statement of intent that British cemeteries are going to be a statement of sacrifice and, if you like, the greatness of empire and what it was. Now, the heavy losses that were incurred in the First World War required a response from the government, which was very much that the missing and the glorious dead. This was required, this attitude of government was required really to mediate the huge mass losses. So out of this, you do get this idea of imperial architecture, if you like, and of course, as you hear at Tyncott, the beautiful cross of sacrifice. And perhaps the epitome of this is represented at Tiapfar, which is this Lutyens memorial, this big statement, if you like, of the British presence and the sacrifices that were made on this site. Now, the original design concept of graves is very simple. Frederick Kenyon, who was the first artistic director of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, he described very, very succinctly how the cemeteries abroad will be designed. And he wrote, "It is desirable that the cemetery should be fenced in by some boundary which will keep out the farmer's plough and his cattle, and wherever possible enclosed by a low wall, such as usually found around a country churchyard, which leaves the ground within open to view." Now, this in fact is Knightsbridge Cemetery near Beaumont Hamel, and I think it is a perfect example of Kenyon's description of how a cemetery should be presented. It starts out as a clearing station for July the 1st on the Somme, and then ends up as a concentration cemetery with bodies being brought in from other cemeteries. And yes, you can see the plough there. But also, if you look on the left-hand side of the frame, you'll see one of the modern problems of cemeteries, because they tend to be in sort of odd rural areas. They're accessed by a path. And of course, this causes problems for farmers with modern machinery because they have to work around these paths. And this is part of, if you like, of the Commonwealth War Graves daily activity in France, is actually reaching out to the farmers and negotiating with them to ensure that there is a continuity of these sites. And this is perhaps one of the best illustrations of this is the grave of 3 soldiers from September 1916 at a place called Fafimont Farm. These 3 men are buried literally in a shell hole and in the middle of a field. And some while ago, the farmer was asked, would he like this to be moved? And he was adamant that he did not want this memorial to be moved. He would continue to fly around it, as you can see, just quite a bit close. But this is an example of the kind of work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have to do in terms of what they do. And this is the cemetery of Delville Wood. And this photograph really shows you all the ingredients that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission are involved in. In the background, you've got the National Memorial to the South Africans. You then have the cross of sacrifice, and then the stone of remembrance, and then the gravestones. So if you like, these are all the ingredients that make up remembrance as it is conducted by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And we're all familiar with the headstones as they are presented, the soldier, the badge. This was Ware's very specific idea that there was a democracy in death, that whether you were a general, a duke, a private, whatever you were, you had a common headstone, because otherwise, previous wars, the wealthy had either shipped their dead back or had put up private memorials. And this was felt that this was just against the commonality of death that was being experienced during the First World War. So here you have a typical collection. This is Dozingham, Belgium. You can see these are headstones that are all being cut. Today, all headstones are cut in Bahrain, in Arras, and they can produce up to 22,000 headstones a year. And of course, with the First World War centenary, they had a massive program of renovation across the cemeteries. And, but they still engrave on the spot. Some engravings are done on the spot by the workmen. And of course, you have the familiar sight, the poignant sight of the soldier of the Great War, an unknown soldier. But of course, he may in fact be buried or commemorated as a name on the headstone on one of the walls. And this is from immediately after the war. The recovery of the bodies took place by recovery parties. And in fact, it was regarded by many soldiers as extremely honorable work, because it was, paying, if you like, a tribute to your comrades. And I'm told, by reliable source, that the soldier on the right is in fact the holder of the Victoria Cross. So here was a man of extreme courage and repute, but there he is acting as part of the burial party. So it was obviously considered to be a very worthy organization. And because it still continues to this day, on average, about 36 bodies a year are found each year. And wherever possible, they are identified. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission does not, generally speaking, go into long DNA tests unless there are very good reasons. Bodies are found in a particular place, or a dated action, and they've got insignia and things like that, and maybe their names that are missing are known from that day, then they will make an effort. But otherwise, it's ruled out on grounds of cost. It's been just too expensive to do it. But it is still very much part of the routine, the duty of it. And this shows you how you get those rows of headstones that are actually set into a concrete channel. And they still use the time-honored masons' methods of bits of string to get all the stones lined up, and there they are, being put into place. This cemetery is at Écus-Saint-Maur in France. Now, I referred earlier to the loyalty of workers to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. This is a picture taken in Ramla in Israel, what was then Palestine. And the old man in the foreground is Ibrahim Khoury with his sons Isa and Johnny. And between them, they have 100 years of service. And they were really quite upset when I visited there because they didn't know I was coming, because they would have got the grandfather to come, because he also had worked for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in his time. So 3 generations of Palestinians had worked in Ramla Cemetery. So quite an extraordinary story. This is in Gallipoli, and again, the man, the second from the right, the grey-haired man, he is the 3rd generation of his family to have worked for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And you notice they really do. These men are obviously all Muslims, but there they are tending a Christian cemetery, doing it incredibly well. There's a real sense of loyalty, which is quite extraordinary. Now, one of the things about cemeteries is that they'll tell a story. The cemeteries themselves tell us stories, just their location. You look at this is obviously Sayre Road, number 3, and Luke Cops cemeteries on some, the jumping off line on July the 1st. And the cross of sacrifice, it's this extraordinary symbol. It's erected in any cemetery that has more than 40 graves, except in Gallipoli, but I'll come to that later. It can be erected on cemeteries where there are fewer than 40, and the crosses get bigger with the numbers in the cemetery. It was designed by an architect, Sir Reginald Blomfield, and he made a very specific statement. This was a man's war. The bronze sword is there to identify it with war. And also there kept ringing in my head that text, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. So you see here, we have a very, very definite intention to make this point of sacrifice. And of course, the cross, it's become so iconic. I mean, I think to me as a photographer, it's almost too simple a photograph to take, to photograph that cross of sacrifice, because wherever you go, there it is. And yes, I've got it at the beginning with the setting sun behind it and things like that. But it does, I think, divert our attention. When we go on battlefields, we should stop looking at the cemeteries and spend more time actually looking at the grounds which created the need for those cemeteries. Because I think by doing that, we are beginning to not so much remember the dead, but we are trying to learn the lessons that we can take from those dead. And of course, you have the stone of remembrance, their name liveth forevermore, which is taken from Ecclesiasticus. The words are, let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us. And some there be which have no memorial, who are perished as though they had never been, and are become as though they had never been born, and their children after them. Their seed standeth fast, and their children for their sakes. Their seed shall remain forever, and their glory shall not be blotted out. Their bodies are buried in peace, but their name liveth forevermore. So really ringing words, again, reinforcing this concept of a nation of sacrifice. And it's perhaps the epitome, which we all know so well, is the Lamenting Gate, with its 54,000 names. And you know those words of Lord Plummer from July 1927 when he opened it, when he spoke to the families of the men whose names are on the gate, saying, he is not missing, he is here. And of course, yes, it is a very unique place. And I think very important in our psyche. I think that when we talk about the lost generation, those 750, 800,000 men that died in the First World War, we need to remember that in fact, between 1910 and 1914, over 1 million men actually emigrated from Britain. So if you like, we lost more men to economic circumstances than we did to the First World War. So I think, I'm not belittling the losses of the First World War. What I am saying is we need to put it into context, because this is very, very important, because we need to learn the lessons. Every man, of course, it's very important to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that every man, his name is rendered as a memorial. And this is the memorial to the missing at Plugsteert, designed by Harold Bradshaw, and constant updating, and of course massive archives. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission archives are really quite remarkable. The details that you can get sometimes are quite fantastic, and it's worth going to. And from the very outset, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission used the best artists that it could do. The classic one is the memorial to Combray at Louvain, where Charles Sergeant Jagger, who himself been wounded 3 times, so he knew a little bit about what he was doing. He actually ignored government policy by showing the consequences of war. And if you look at this wounded man, which you can see here on the stretcher being lifted out of the trench, if you look at that hand there, as it grasps the stretcher, you can see the pain he's got with his wounded leg, which is splintered up there with a rifle. So, you know, this is reality of war. I mean, quite extraordinarily so, and commissioned. And this is the memorial at Nieuwpoort, again, Jagger. And the architect for this was a man called Bryce Binney, who had an MC and 2 bars. So the people who were involved in this work, they really had a real emotional involvement with the work they were doing. And I think it shows in what they do. And perhaps none better than the Memorial of Soissons by Eric Kennington. He was a war man. He'd been a war artist in the First World War. And he actually enlisted, but was wounded. He's perhaps best known for the fact that he did the drawings for T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And again, he served in World War II, but this time in the Home Guard. So again, a man who did his time. You've got this incredibly sort of enigmatic, powerful figures of the War Memorial in Soissons. Now, cemeteries like this one at Lissenhoek, they provide a real background for education. This is a school party, and having the cemetery explained to them by a guide, Joe Hook, from the International Guild of Battlefield Guides. And so these are places where you can take young people and begin to explain the lessons of the war. Lissenhoek, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, is actually a concentration cemetery, and the 2nd largest on the Ypres salient. And then you get others which are incredibly small and personal. I always find, this is the Devonshire Cemetery at Mansell Copse. I always find this incredibly moving. I'm sure most of you have been there. If you haven't, the story behind it is that the company commanding officer who was leading the company here had predicted that their attack on the 1st of July, if the artillery didn't actually wipe out a machine gun post, they would actually have a bad time of it. And indeed, that's what happened. And as they left this copse, they were caught in the fire from the machine gun, and there are 163 graves that died, from the Devonshires that died that day. And there's a very poignant letter from the Padre, the Reverend Cross, who wrote, "My dear babe, so our game of tennis will have to wait for a bit. The total loss is heavy. Martin, Hodgson, Holcroft, Rayner, Riddle, Adamson, Hurst Shepherd have all gone to their long home. Nearly all the casualties were just by the magpie's nest. I buried all I could collect in our frontline trench. So the Devonshire Cemetery is very much a cemetery where literally the dead were picked up, tipped into the trench and covered over. So it's a very poignant, very specific reflection on the nature of war. And then, of course, as a contrast, the variety of work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do. This is illustrated. This is on Skyross. This is the home, the grave of Rupert Brooke. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And believe you me, this is not an easy place to get to, but as you can see, it's absolutely immaculately kept. This is in Italy, this is Asiago, and the grave of Edward Britton, the brother of Vera Britton. And you know, the lesson to take away from this is that we always talk about the death of the soldiers, but we very rarely think about the impact this had on the people at home. And Vera Britton wrote, "There came the sudden clattering at the front door knocker that always meant a telegram. For a moment, I thought my legs would not carry me, but they behaved quite normally as I got up and went to the door. I knew what was in the telegram. I had known for a week. I opened and read it in a tearful anguish of suspense. Regret to inform you that Captain E.H. Britton, MC, killed in action, Italy, June 15th. No answer, I told the boy mechanically and handed the telegram to my father, who had followed me into the hall. Long after my family had gone to bed and the world had grown silent, I crept into the dining room to be alone with Edward's portrait. He had been through so much, far, far more than those beloved friends who had died at an earlier stage of the interminable war, leaving him alone to mourn their loss. And suddenly, as I remembered all the dear afternoons and evenings when I had followed him on the piano as he played the violin, the sad searching eyes of the portrait were more than I could bear. And falling on my knees before I began to cry, Edward, oh Edward, in dazed repetition, as though my persistent crying and calling would somehow bring him back. Stories from Commonwealth cemeteries. Well, there is not enough time. I'm Irish, and there's not enough time for me tonight to talk about the Irish situation, but we all know the conflict that happened in Ireland, the Ulster Division, the Irish Division, and the whole thing of Irish, the Easter Rising. And here we have this extraordinary situation where Margaret Naylor is shot crossing Ringsend Drawbridge on the 29th of April during the Easter Rising, on the same day that her husband is fighting in action with the Dublin Fusiliers. An extraordinary sort of example of the complexities of the Irish diaspora, and yes, the anomalies that are created. Husband and wife being effectively killed on the same day. Yes, quite extraordinary. This is the cemetery at Arc la Bataille, and if you see, you can see there old Chinese Labour Corps. They all died actually after the end of the war. Probably they died from two things, either from Spanish influenza, most likely that, or possibly from mishandling explosives, because they were used to clear the battlefields. But these graves, I think, represent one of the most extraordinary stories that we should take away from the First World War, because China, in 1914, was beginning to emerge, if you like, from isolation. The late 19th century, European powers had tried to colonize bits, but take bits of it, notably Hong Kong. There'd been the Boxer Rising in 1900, where as a result of reparations, European countries have taken various bits of China, including the Germans, who took a region called Qingdao. And you may be familiar with this because when you go to a Chinese restaurant, if you have a Chinese beer, it's almost certainly going to be Qingdao beer that you're given. Qingdao beer is German beer because the Germans started brewing beer that we went there. Now, what happens is that 1914 comes along, we encourage the Japanese to go in and seize these places, which they duly did. And during the war, the Chinese government, the Republican government, decides it would be good to win influence and favor with the Western allies, which they were anxious to do, if they sent workers. So they sent over 200,000 Chinese workers who were sent to Europe to work with the French and the British. They were doing, digging trenches, building roads. Some of them were doing very skilled work. They were repairing tanks and railway trains. They were laying railway tracks. So they were a very, very important part of our war effort. And so come the Versailles Peace Treaty, conference, the Chinese believe that they are going to be given some consideration by the Allies. No, they're not. We basically blank them and we give Qingdao to the Japanese. And the result is that on May the 4th, 1919, the students in Peking, as it was then, now Beijing, hold a major demonstration. It's on May the 4th. And because of modern telegraphy in China, this news spreads very rapidly across China. And China feels humiliated by this. They really do. And it sparks a whole renaissance in Chinese thinking, transformation in social attitudes, political thinking. They even decide to modernize their Chinese language. Science, they really decide that they need to change their whole way of life. And the extraordinary result of this is with the political unrest is that in 1921, a young librarian from Peking University is part of a small group that adopt, in fact, if you like, the Western idea of communism. And they found the Chinese Communist Party. That young librarian, we now know him as Mao Zedong. But my point is this, is that the way in which we treated the Chinese and did not consider them after the war in 1919 was a direct precursor to the formation of the Chinese Communist Party as it is today. So as they say, as you sow, so ye shall reap. And I think we've really got to take away from this, it just shows that when you fight a war, you must think about what you're going to do at the end of it. And it's quite clear to me, maybe this is a political point, is that we didn't learn that lesson in Iraq, and we most certainly did not learn it in Afghanistan. So there are lessons to be learned from cemeteries, which we are not necessarily very good at picking up. Obviously, the concept of empire is represented here as the beautiful Indian memorial at Neuve-Chapelle, created by Sir Herbert Baker, who in fact had done a lot of the buildings in South Africa and India. So it's perhaps fitting that he did it. And this is Villers-Bretonneux, the Australian cemetery. Again, this sort of strong representation of empire. And you can see how important this idea is of the cross of sacrifice. It really is there. And it's not just within the cemetery, but you can see it from miles away. And it contrasts completely with this cemetery, which is in Namibia, in Trekopi. It's right in the middle of Namib Desert. There's absolutely nothing there, literally, apart from a railway track and the sign. And here is this cemetery. It's a little skirmish that takes place in 1915. There's just 16 dead. And Here is the German mass grave with the Commonwealth War Graves markers in the back. You'll notice there are dark stone. This is, again, flexibility in the stone from which headstones are made is practiced throughout the world. And it just shows the care that is still taken. This place is literally a 3-hour drive from anywhere in the middle of the desert. And this is in Morogoro Cemetery in Tanzania. This is Shadrach Paul and his wife who look after the cemetery. And I hadn't been in the cemetery for more than a minute when they appeared. They're incredibly proud of what they're doing. And one of the problems that they have in Africa, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is addressing it today, is that they've now set up a special missing names committee. It's reckoned that about 350,000 African porters are not commemorated anywhere because their losses were so massive. The war in East Africa was particularly difficult. They were marching long distances. You're out in the bush. If someone dies of fever, you don't have the time to dig iron hard ground to try and bury them. So the bodies were left in the bush, quite literally. Not a good reflection on, our standards, but that's what happened at the time. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission are trying to do something about it. This is the beach cemetery at Anzac and Gallipoli. And you can see that the headstones are different. They are actually lowered, so they don't jut up so much. This is out of respect to the fact that is it in an Islamic country? There is no cross of sacrifice. There will be a war memorial at the back of the cemetery. So there is an adaptation of styles, but I think this cemetery and the Anzac cemeteries, they are quite extraordinary in the sense that anyone who's been to Gallipoli will tell you how well received one is by the Turks. And indeed, the model for this was set back in 1934 by Kemal Ataturk, who, of course, had fought at Gallipoli. And so in 1934, a lot of relatives go back to Anzac Cove, and Ataturk is there to greet them. And his speech, I think personally, is one of the great statesman-like speeches of reconciliation of all time, because he says, those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mohammeds to us. Where they lied side by side here in this country of ours, you, the mothers who sent your sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. And having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. I defy anyone to find a more conciliatory statement than that. Quite remarkable. I think, it is. I think we should be humbled by that when we go to Gallipoli. This is one of my favorite cemeteries of all time. It was, I came across it by accident in Jamaica. It's the first time in my life that I have ever had a rum and smoked weed before breakfast. I was driving by and I saw a marker saying Commonwealth War Grave, and I went in and I came across this lovely old boy, Calvin Hill, who's the local stonemason, and he took me through this very overgrown cemetery, and there was this incredibly well tended for grave of a soldier of Alexander Bennett from the British West Indian Regiment, 1917. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission operates in so many different countries. It is actually an incredibly good way of, if you like, soft diplomacy. In fact, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has a senior director who was previously a senior official within the Foreign Office, because they do travel to all sorts of countries. This is actually the cemetery in Jerusalem, and it illustrates one of the problems faced by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission today. Because if you look, this beautiful green grass, any of you who have been to Jerusalem will know that green grass is not something that you commonly see in Jerusalem. It comes at a price, the price of water. And one of the great problems facing Commonwealth War Graves Commission today is water. It's global warming. Cemeteries which, in hot areas are becoming even hotter. So they are having to adapt to different ways of presenting the cemeteries. And it's a very important part of their modern work, really quite critical, because this could become a political issue in the Middle East with water shortages. This is another example of the nature of the work. This is in, the memorial to the Mohammedan cemetery of the Egyptian Labour Corps. And this is just outside the old city wall of Jerusalem. And this is in East Jerusalem, so one is in the Palestinian area. So there are problems of security and things like that. And indeed, when I was out there and I was supposed to go to Gaza, and I drove down to Gaza with the British military attache's assistant who was taking me there. And we got to the border and we were told, no, you can't come in, but we have permits. No, you can't come in. And this was a British diplomat who was being denied access. So we had to turn around and go back to Jerusalem. So there are problems of management throughout the world. So they have to be a very diplomatic organization. This is St Finland's Island, Loch Sheil, up in the Highlands. And this is the burial island, Loch Sheil, which in fact until recently was men only. Up there on the island is this rather splendid granite cross, granite headstone to a deckhand who died there. So really, again, in all extraordinary places, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission pops up to do that. And when we go on battlefield tours, we very, very rarely ever talk about the Royal Navy. And yet one must bear in mind that in 1917, when the Germans declared unconditional submarine warfare on the basis that they had to starve us out before the Americans got involved, 25% of all ships sailing for Britain was sunk in April of 1917. And we only had about 6 weeks worth of wheat left in the country. And if it hadn't been for the Royal Navy, we would have lost the First World War because we would have been starved out of it. So we do forget very often the Royal Navy. This is the Plymouth Naval Memorial with 23,000 names. And there are 2 others at Chatham and at Portsmouth. And in fact, it actually has a practical purpose because if you look, it's very closely aligned with the lighthouse and it's actually designed to be a leading mark for the Royal Naval ships coming in. And as you can see, the ship in the background there. Now, people often ask me, what is the most extraordinary cemetery that you've been to? And as I said, I've been to 400 of them. And, obviously, some of them, you bring you to silence. But the one that I found the most poignant is in the hills of Saskatchewan in Canada. This is about 4 or 5 miles from the nearest road. I only found it because of a local farmer. And you can see there are 2 headstones. And the one on the right belongs to Donald Pollock, Saskatchewan Regiment. And you see he dies after the war is finished. He dies on the 15th of November, 1918. And you can imagine You know, this little homestead high up in the hills, miles from anywhere, and he comes home, and you can imagine the joy his mother had at getting her son back from the war unharmed. But he's brought Spanish influenza, and he dies. And she would have been standing by watching him, totally hopeless, nothing she could do, as he drowned in his own fluids. The real kicker here is that the other white headstone in this, the tiny plot, is to his brother Alexander, his twin brother, born the same day, died the same day, the 15th of November. What a thought, what a thought. You know, when you think of all we've gone through with COVID, this was 100 years ago, the same thing happened. And of course, finally, Tyncott and those extraordinary words of King George V. I have many times asked myself whether there can be more potent advocates of peace upon earth through the years to come than this massed multitude of silent witnesses to the desolation of war. And I just wish that maybe more of our statesmen thought about those words and the implications of the cemeteries. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was incredible. Thanks, Mike. Absolutely stunning photographs there. The lighting on them was just incredible. One of the early questions was from Becca Bernstein, who can't join on video, who says, could you ask this question for me? During World War II, how much damage and destruction occurred to some of these cemeteries? And was there the ability to fix these World War I grave sites?
Well, interestingly enough, the Indian memorial at Neuve Chapelle was hit. There are instances of damage. I believe I'm right in saying that there was only one World War I memorial to the British Empire dead that was destroyed, and that showed an Australian soldier with his foot on the neck of a German imperial eagle. So it was a bit sort of provoking, shall we say. But really, damage, yes, there was damage on occasions. It was largely incidental, largely incidental. But as I said, my project was involved entirely with the First World War. So I am not an expert on the consequences of the Second World War.
Okay, thanks. Dick, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Thank you for hosting tonight. Mike, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting talk. And can I also congratulate you on the quality of the photographs as well, because good photographs always amplify the talk, and they were brilliant. I don't know if you're the photographer, but congratulations to whoever was.
No, I am the photographer, yes.
Well done.
That was my, yes.
Well done. My question was really about the comment you made. I think you quoted 36 is the average number of remains that are still recovered annually. I was wondering, when they are recovered and there's no other identifiable material with them, how is it decided on who will take care of the burial? Because we won't know if they were German, French, Commonwealth or whatever. Do you know how that process takes place?
Well, generally speaking, as far as I know, they are, because of the location, they are generally able to get a fix on whether they are British or German. But the thing is this, and this is a point I should have made, and I'll make it now, is the British, we have always buried the dead of any nation in our cemeteries and not in a special plot. The French will bury Germans in their cemeteries, but in a special plot. We will literally bury the soldier next to other soldiers The German headstone will be slightly different in shape, but we have always honored whoever the man is, and he would then be buried obviously with an unknown soldier as the thing. But that is the way it's done. And I mean, I think it is to the everlasting credit of Fabian Ware that at such an early time in the conflict, all these great policy decisions were made, which I think 100 years later have stood the test of time. Quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dick. Okay, another question in. I've tried to bring the gentleman, bring him up in a video window. Kel Webb, who says, working in Japan last year, visited the lads at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission site in Yokohama. Why are the headstones there set in the ground and not of the standard type seen in Europe?
Well, it could be that the ground is unstable and that it is possibly an earthquake zone. But again, as I said, I only photograph First World War, so I am not an expert on Yokohama, which is Second World War. So, sorry about that. But I would say it is probably because of ground instability.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure if this is a question. John Azar has asked for a comment on cut-off dates.
Yes.
That's it.
Comment on cut-off dates.
Maybe I'll bring John in and just, I'll move on. I'll bring John in. And
those are the official dates when the conflict, because don't forget, we don't actually end the conflict. Gosh, I should know this, but the actual official end of the war isn't until, I think it's 1922 or maybe even 23, when we actually end the war with Turkey. We don't actually sign off until that. But those are the cutoff dates. Quite how they come by them, I do not know. But those are the official dates that I quoted.
Okay. Sandra. Okay, I'll read Sandra's question out. She'd like to ask about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in the UK and about women casualties.
Yes, sorry. Well, they're based at Maidenhead, is their headquarters. Women casualties are included in the cemeteries. And in fact, I know of one cemetery where there's a child is actually commemorated. And certainly there is a cemetery near Soissons where there is a lady whose name I've forgotten at the moment. She is buried under a Commonwealth War Graves headstone because she was actually working in a canteen, a tea canteen at the railway station in Soissons in 1916. And it's described that she was killed by un soldat dérangé, a mad soldier. So obviously it was, shell shocked or whatever, and he shot her dead. And she is buried along with other British war dead. It's as simple as that. Okay. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a bit difficult when we can't. So sorry about that.
Thanks, Sandra. John, sorry, I misrepresented your comment earlier. Do you want to ask Mike?
Yeah, well, that's more a comment, and like when you finished, Mike, excellent presentation, and I love your photographs. And you showed the photograph in Saskatchewan, and the fellow came home. So I do a lot of military tours, First World War related, in the local heritage cemeteries here in Vancouver Island. And the cutoff dates between war dead and everybody else are questions you get quite often. And so what happens is you get a contrast between a Commonwealth War Graves marker for somebody who never went overseas, but he died within the cutoff dates. There's one case here where he was on furlough before going overseas, died in a hunting accident. So he's war dead. And you contrast that next to a marker where the person had military cross, bar, etc. He lived fairly long life afterwards with just a very, very plain little family marker. In another cemetery, I came across a marker, and the epitaph really struck me. It said, "Died after long suffering, patiently borne." And so, you know, I'm a big fan of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and what they do, but I just want people to remember that there are a lot of great stories in your local cemeteries of people who served in the war, and a lot of them without any recognition. And it's easy to do a tour. You only need about 10 stories in your local cemetery and people will come out. So I just want to encourage that. So thank you, Mike, and thanks for Simon for letting me make that comment.
I think one of the, certainly as a battlefield guide myself, I think one of the problems is that, as Richard Holmes would have said, cemeteries can bend history because it is very, very easy to tell the story of the man under the headstone because you've got a name, you've got a regiment, you've got a date, you go to the war diaries and you can tell his story, etc., etc. The stories that is so hard to tell are the stories of the men who came home and didn't ever talk about it.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that we forget. And sometimes, you know, they can be absolutely fascinating when you do get hold of them. So it is one of those things that cemeteries, we can get, I think sometimes we can get a bit obsessed with cemeteries. As I said earlier on, one needs to learn the stories, the lessons that those cemeteries can teach us, like the Chinese and things like that.
Oh, by the way, I just want to mention all the majority of the Chinese Labor Corps came across the Pacific. They encamped just south of Victoria in British Columbia, where I live.
They were trained
on
across
the island. They were secretly taken by train across the country.
Yeah.
Even rail buffs didn't know about this,
Yeah,
and then shipped over to Europe, and then they made a return journey after the war. Fascinating story for another time. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. Thank you very much. Dave, your turn.
An odd question, perhaps. I've heard somewhere that the top of the stone of remembrance is not flat, but follows the curve of the earth. Has anybody confirmed that?
It has, yes, it is based on the Greek things of architecture. But it's very subtle. So it does mean yes. No, they are beautiful.
Oh, right. Thank you. A story that's true.
Thanks, Dave. David Bowley Booth, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Can hear you, yeah.
Okay, were the cemeteries started on the Western Front before others in different parts of the world, or was it started at sort of at the same sort of time, or did it vary where they were?
Well, cemeteries started very early on. I'm not quite sure when the first cemetery was established, but obviously there are battlefield cemeteries, and as you go, you know, if you go to the battlefield, well, for example, on the Aisne, there's a cemetery there that started immediately in September of 1914. The battlefields are loose. These cemeteries were being.
Some were created during the war, obviously.
Yes. Oh no. They have to, because you just
was there any priority put on the Western Front because it was obviously in France and a European power, and they wanted to get on with things, and other countries left? You know,
it happened simultaneously across the world. It was a
with the
massive...
Commonwealth Graves Commission sort of thing being in charge. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. I've tried to bring Martin in. I don't know if he's been shy or there's a technical problem, but Martin says, he comments on the photographs in your talk about how superb they were, particularly the aerial ones, and he wants to know, were they from any particular source? Are they available from any particular source?
Well, they're available from me. I'm the photographer. I'm the photographer. So all those pictures that you've seen were taken from the Commonwealth War Graves book, the centenary book, which they commissioned me to do. So they are available from me.
On the website, just so that they know where to go?
Well, one can go to Mary Evans if you Google Mary Evans collection, which is a picture library that I use. But if people want to contact me, I can provide prints of it.
Okay, lovely. Linda.
Hi, I just wanted to say I have a copy of the book. I've had it for a few years and I turn to it regularly. I really value it. I love the pictures, they're stunning. And I wondered, as a photographer, which photograph Mike was most proud of and why?
That's a very hard question. I'm proud of all the photographs. One of the problems about when you start rating them, you probably remember the one that took the most effort. It may not be the best picture, but you remember the fact that, you paddled up a canoe with alligators chasing after you and whatever it is, and you get this picture at the end of it. It's got to be a good picture because you escape the alligators. In fact, it's probably pretty rubbish, but I think, well, it's very hard to say. I suppose in a way, it's the shot of Tyncott in the snow, because that did, yes, it was an overnight drive to get there. And when I arrived, I'm busy starting to shoot, and suddenly from right wing comes this little John Deere tractor chugging across the picture. And I think the gardener was totally shaken by the fact this sort of sudden maniacal photographers charging at him saying, go away, you're spoiling the picture. I don't want any tracks on the snow. And he was great. And he went off to his little shed, and I went round there about 20 minutes later, frozen stiff. And yes, there was very good coffee with something in it. They're great people, the Commonwealth Commission gardeners. They really are. They're fantastic.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, and it gives me, I've been to Tyncott a number of times because I take school parties, but we always go in July, and I've never been in the winter. So it gives me a different perspective as well.
I always say to people, if you really want to see cemeteries at their best, go there at first light. Because they really are, that's when you have the light.
Can't get 45 children up that early.
Yes.
But thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering there, everybody's familiar with the wooden crosses we see out on the continent that were put down, before the actual stone headstones appeared. But did the same sort of thing happen over here in the UK? How were the graves marked before the stone headstones were actually placed?
I do not know the answer to that question. Sorry.
Right. Okay. It seems to be one of those hard ones. Nobody knows.
Sorry about that.
Thanks, Michael. Gordon, welcome. I'm pleased you're on. Go for it.
Good evening, Simon. Yes, I was so taken up with all this. It's fascinating. I haven't got a sensible question to ask, really, other than
because I probably haven't a sensible answer. So.
I just wondered if there was any truth, or was this an apocryphal tale that the Brodie helmet added to the Brodie soldier, the Canadian memorial, added after the war, or was it done at the same time? And so I went on a tour, and somebody said that, or one of the tour guides said that the helmet, the Brodie helmet, was added to the statue after.
Sorry, which statue?
The brooding soldier, the Canadian brooding soldier.
At Vancouver Corner.
Vancouver Corner, yeah.
Put it this way, I would have thought it would have been impossible to have added a helmet.
Well, that's what I thought.
Because, and very difficult to do it. But no, I do not know the answer to that question.
No, well, I've asked before and I couldn't get an answer, but it was just he seemed quite sure of what he was saying, this chap, and so I was just thought I'd ask someone who would know things.
You know, there are so many. I mean, I've stood in Langemark and heard a guide saying that all the soldiers in the graves, because there was a shortage of space, they were buried standing upright.
Really? There's a lot of things. There was also a tale that that Adolf Hitler said that they dictated that the cemeteries weren't to be abused or damaged by the German forces in the Second World War. However, he did object to the father and mother in the German cemetery.
Oh, Kathy Kolbitz, yes.
Yes. Because they should have been proud. Apparently, they should have been proud to have offered their son up for the fatherland.
Well, of course, you do have this peculiar thing that there were some of the gardeners were actually allowed to stay in situ during the Second World War because they were because British cemeteries included German war dead.
Right.
So, and it's one of those extraordinary things that, you know, one of those little quirks that happens.
Do the Germans have a War Graves Commission?
Yes, they do. I cannot pronounce the name because it's a very long word. It's abbreviated to VDK. It is very different from ours in that it has no formal funding.
Right, so it's
charitable. A charity. So they have to operate on a fairly shoestring thing. And in fact, most of their work for the last 10 years or so has been in Eastern Europe because with the coming down of the Iron Curtain, German cemeteries have become a rich source of, if you like, memorabilia.
Yeah.
And I've seen photographs of German cemeteries which have literally been dug up by a digger.
Really?
Just, yes. There was 1 year, this would have been, I think it was not 2015, they actually reinterred 40,000 bodies from Eastern Europe, brought back to Germany. So it's a massive operation they've got.
Did the Germans have to buy the land from the French to bury the dead? Because I didn't think the French would be inclined to give them land after what they'd put them through.
I don't know whether they've certainly been given the land in perpetuity. I don't think they had to buy it. I think it was given to them, but basically on fairly confined spaces. And, you know, you go to German cemeteries, you know, when you go to Langemark, there's that area the size of a tennis court once you walk in to the cemetery with 27,000 bodies.
It's unbelievable. I've been there, yeah. And I think that all war dead should be respected, irrespective. I mean, it's purely geography. Whether you're born in England, born in Germany, you're the same man, you're the same painter and decorator, the same plumber that just goes to war and loses his life, and it's abhorrent, really.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gordon.
Right, sorry, I've gone on a bit. Sorry about that. See you. Thank you very much again, Mike. It was fabulous.
All right. Take care, Gordon. Right, we've got Sandra back, who's got her microphone working and also believes
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go for it.
Got it. I'm hoping Michael's still on because I can actually answer his question. The Michael who asked about what happened over here. I'm an eyes-on, hands-on coordinator for the Commonwealth War Graves. We have some 1,600 volunteers working on the British mainland, looking after the scattered graves. And how it worked over here is when the casualties died, the families put up private memorials. And at the end of the war, the CWGC or the Imperial War Graves Commission went along and said to them, would you like one of our graves? Well, a lot of the families had spent a lot of money on their memorials and they naturally said, well, no, thank you very much. I've got a 5-foot cross that looks absolutely beautiful. And 106 years later down the line, that little cross is now leaning, the letters are coming off, it's falling over. So what the volunteers, I mean, I cover a huge chunk of the Midlands and parts of Wales. And what my volunteers do, and my fellow coordinators volunteers, they go out, they photograph these graves, the scattered graves and private memorials, Commonwealth War Graves. We train them up to clean the Commonwealth War Graves to help our teams, because we don't have enough teams. Unlike France and Belgium, where you've got a lot of teams going round, we don't have that over here. We've got small teams. I've got 2 teams in my area. They cover all of Wales and all of the Midlands between them. So it's about a 2 to 3 year cycle to get around and look after the Commonwealth War Graves in this country. So they started the Eyes on Hands on 2 years ago, well, yeah, 2.5 years ago now. And it's proving really, really successful. Lots of members of the public, 1,600 odd of them, have come forward throughout Scotland and England and Wales. And they go out every 6 months or so, and they report back on all our graves and look after them. So in terms of wooden crosses, the only wooden crosses I know of in this country are ones that were brought home from the battlefields overseas when the family were offered them. There were some in Cheltenham underneath a wooden covering, and there was one in a church in Worcester, and there may be others, but they didn't actually, to my knowledge, anyone else used the wooden crosses over here. It was private memorials, and sometimes the family said, yes, we will have a CWG headstone. And when those private memorials fail, legally we can't touch them. A CWGC can't do anything unless we can find family. So we put a pedestal marker, the equivalent of a Gallipoli marker, or if the ground will take it, we put a Commonwealth War Grave in. So we do look after them here. We might not have rows and rows like they do in France of immaculate, but the ones we do have are very much looked after over here. And I hope Michael got that. I hope he's still on.
Well, I can tell you Michael's on, he's listening.
Yes,
He's a hands-on volunteer, and he's training as a volunteer guide, which is why he wants to know the answer, because he's expecting to be asked. So
right. So he's doing the speaker. He's not an. Is he an eyes-on, hands-on volunteer? Did he say?
It's an eyes-on, hands-on.
Right. Okay. So he should have had that in his training. Did he say where he is in the country? He's not mine.
Do you want to bring him on? You can have a chat.
Yeah, bring him on. We'll do it quickly and get it done with, because I'm sure people will get bored with us.
Yeah, you've only got a couple of minutes, so.
Okay, I'll keep it short.
I'll just quickly find him. Where are we?
Because I was asking about nurses. That's what I research. Big into nurses, because I'm a nurse myself.
Do you want to talk about that for a minute while I'm bringing Michael in?
Yeah, I just collect that a lot of nurses aren't on war memorials, so their graves are their only memorial. So I'm quite passionate about finding those graves that are over here. There are some overseas. The Tart Play's got some. Listen Soak, of course, has got Nellie Spindler, and there's various others. And there's Michael.
Go on, you got 2 minutes.
Oh, Michael, where are you?
I'm up in Newcastle.
Oh, so you come under Frank? Is he your coordinator?
That's right. Yeah, I've only been doing the eyes on, hands on for a few months, and the volunteer guide I've literally started my training about a week ago. So it's all quite new. But everyone I've asked that question about how the graves were marked over here doesn't seem to know the answer. So that's what you told us there.
That's what I train my volunteers, because that's what I was told. That's what they are. They're the private memorials, and the family paid for them. So Frank probably, I don't know, we've all had new training. There's all been all sorts of training, but welcome. I'm glad we've got some EOHO volunteers here. So good luck with the speaker and the tour guides. I think that'd be good.
Me and my wife are both volunteers. She's a nurse as well, and we're interested in the nursing. So I can't wait to hear your question as well.
Oh, well, it's too late because I've run out of time, but I research nurses. You can find me through Frank. If you get your wife to speak to me, because I've got nursing memorabilia like you wouldn't believe, autograph books, uniforms, 1,400 nurses on my database who've died in, and they're going online on a website very imminently. So I'm happy to have a chat with your wife. So get Frank to put you in touch with me.
I will, thanks.
Cheers,
all right,
Michael.
thanks, Michael.
Thanks,
Simon.
Sandra.
Thank you both. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to wind it up there. There have been some of the conversations going on via the Q&A, which we don't have time for at the moment.
Someone's put up a CWGC cemetery was built in 1960. Sorry to disagree, but Fromell, which I think is 2014, is the last last CWG cemetery to be built, that obviously was built to house the bodies of the Australian soldiers that were found at Fromell. So very much, still very much active in that sense.
Okay. I think we're done then, Mike.
Right, good.
That was a fantastic talk, a really great one to wind the season up with.
We got it done without any technical glitches.
Yeah, well, yeah, we actually got through it tonight, so well done. So thank you once again to Mike, if you can show your appreciation. As this hasn't gone out in Facebook, we will try and get it up quickly on our YouTube channel. We had 1 or 2 people join late and said, ask when it's going up. Can't give you a date, but hopefully very quickly. So that's it, really. Normally I tell you what's coming next week, but the answer is nothing. This is the last one of the season. We will be back. David and I are already starting to talk to speakers to line them up ready for probably around October. So keep an eye out in the press on the WFA website. So just saying thank you once again to Mike. And that's it. Any last words, Mike?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And actually, yes, I would like to say something personal. And this is really directed at gentlemen that are listening. If you get to a certain age like I do go to your doctor and ask for what is known as a PSA test. We don't talk about it. And as the specialist said to me, ladies have breasts, we gentlemen have prostates. Please, please go and get your PSA tested. It's very simple. It's not foolproof, but it may give you an early warning of something which the NHS, God bless it, will help save your life. It's happening to me right now. And I'm really passionate about men getting PSA tests for prostate cancer. So this is a very personal message to you. Please, please go and have it done. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
Right.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in over the last couple of years, really. We'll see you again in the autumn. But thanks again to Mike, and thanks to everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hinky, pinky, parlez-vous. The officers get